Hello. Can anyone hear me?
Hey,
Yes, we can.
Jeremy.
Cool. Thanks. Teams stole my audio again. The virtual audio input device that goes to nowhere. Give it one more minute. All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the Tuesday, April 16th SIG Multicluster meeting. Looks like we have Arthur up first.
Hey, hello everyone. This is my first meeting. So my context is that I'm trying to implement MCS API into Cilium cluster mesh. For info, there's already much of the work done because, for instance, Gateway API of Cilium now supports service import, and you also can sync endpoint slice with some Cilium annotation that will sync endpoint slice with the right labels that endpoint slice, that MCS API preconize. And now I'm trying to add the final step, which is the service import and export. And when I read about that in the KEP, I think that the way the KEP want us to expose conflict is not really adapted to what Cilium does, because basically in Cilium, cluster mesh works by there is a component that reads the Kubernetes API and sync to a DB local to its cluster. So this is how it exports stuff. So there is no really conflict to have there because you own all the data and you just mirror what's in Kubernetes API. But at import time, you read all the cluster data, and then you figure out, this service A in cluster A is headless, and this same service in cluster B is not headless. So what should we do here? But this is more an import time thing than an export. So I wanted to propose to add this condition field into service import, and that, depending on the implementation and what you do, you would expose this conflict on import or export, basically. Yeah. I don't know if that makes sense to everyone.
I think it does, but I'm trying to understand, like, so when we defined the status and conflicts on the export, the idea was that the service owner is the one who's doing the exporting, and they would want to know if they're clashing with another service. If it's import time, then it seems like the way we've kind of looked at it is the export is owned by the service producer, the import is read by consumers. It seems like this kind of shifts conflict resolution to the consumer. Does that
I
make sense?
see. Yeah, it makes sense. Um, I also asked the question in the channel, but like I could expose that at export time, and it would kind of the user would have this info, but it's just that it wouldn't really reflect what the implementation is doing, because I would actually resolve that at import time, but expose that at export time. But maybe it makes more sense for the user, as you were saying. I don't know.
Well, the thing that, like, if we stick to the namespace sameness across clusters that are doing exports, then it should be the same service owner in multiple clusters. So this conflict would be up to the service owner, the producer, to resolve, because ideally it's their service they're conflicting with, and this would just be like a mistake. If this is conflicting because somebody else has created a service, then that then we're kind of going against what we were aiming for with namespace sameness and the consistent ownership. Does that
Mhm.
does that make sense? I'm curious if other folks have thoughts on this. Mike?
So I don't entirely understand the constraints that you're working with within Cilium, but I basically have a like idea of future use case for status conditions on service import for basically the case that you were just talking about, Jeremy, of like in a scenario where there is not namespace sameness. So like if you're doing cross cluster set, exporting from one cluster set and consuming within a different one where you're like bridging across that boundary where you cannot guarantee it. So that would mean that you could not necessarily know where to automatically create a service import. You would be creating the service import manually and trying to reference an exported thing. So like that uh, I think it's a similar-ish scenario of like if you're trying to reference an invalid thing, then you need something of like this reference was not successful. Um, I want to read more about the Cilium architecture to understand like how their existing cluster mesh implementation is doing like exports and imports.
Yeah, same. I I I mean, regardless of adding conditions on service import, which doesn't sound really super controversial, honestly, uh, uh, like I don't know that there's a problem with exposing that. But the use case to me seems a little definitely like a new thing we haven't really got into. The like consuming across cluster sets. Uh, we have not like done anything to design that so far. I think like the idea is everything so far is within a cluster set. If we wanted to be able to export across cluster set, that would be a whole new undertaking.
Yeah, it's a huge new scope. I'm not suggesting we take it on now. I just this primitive would also be useful for that.
By the way, there's kind of the same scenario, but slightly different than what you are saying, because in Cilium, we can configure service with annotation. So basically, there would probably be a case where you want to add annotation to service import and reflect those annotation to the underlying services. So for instance, if you are doing GitOps and stuff like that, I guess you could enter in a scenario like Mike described for Cilium, even if it's not really the exact same thing.
For Cilium cluster mesh, is there like a existing current universal assumption of multiple clusters have namespace sameness, or is the like is that something that's like manually defined of like the namespace foo in one cluster means the same thing as namespace foo in another? Is that something that you have to like configure manually, or is that assumed?
So I can add a bit more context. So right now, the state is that you have multiple services and you have to add annotation to it. Like I think it's io.celium.io/global-services, something like that. And you have to manually create those services in every cluster that you want. There is no automatic export and importing. And my plan is to basically had a controller that just create the backing services that have the right annotation and not touch the underlying multi-cluster features, basically. Yeah. So that's the current state. But I mean, I don't have an issue really not having this condition into service import, but I was kind of wondering because I guess, for instance, in Google, you have probably a central services and service export just push those info there. And I guess these central services return you error that you just expose in the export. So it's it should be really convenient, but yeah.
Well, they're not central, right? They could be distributed in any
Ah,
number of clusters. And if you create like that's kind of, if it was central, it's easy because I mean, if you had a central service and there's no conflicts, um,
okay.
uh, right? The problem is uh, how do we resolve conflicts when a service can be exported from any number of clusters, and
Hmm.
there are certain parts of the export that need to agree, or there's unpredictable behavior, and so the conflict, like the plan with conflicts, is really just try to make it easy to reason about. Um,
But like, do you
where
have the same thing where you um, resolve the conflict at import time but expose it to the export object, or is it not really like that?
um, there's an attempt to resolve conflicts, but no, everything is at export time.
Okay.
I think like conflict should show up when you create a service export that's conflicting. Um, the conflict should show up basically as a result of that action. I mean, it's Kubernetes, so everything's async, but um,
Yeah.
uh, like the idea is that a service consumer doesn't have to know where the service is coming from, whether it's in
Mm.
their cluster or another cluster, et cetera. And so if we made the consumer deal with the conflict, then like who do they talk to resolve it? Like a consumer doesn't own that service, so how do they fix the conflict?
Okay, I see. Mm. I mean, if it's, I mean, it's user versus implementation or something like that. Like, if I'm fine taking it with the user way and showing it to the user because it's exporting the services, I don't think it would shift too much the implementation. Just that, well, it is not, well, I will be treating it at import time, really, behind the hood, but exposing it at the export time. I think this is fine. But yeah.
Okay. I would really be curious to read up on the. I'll read up on the way cluster mesh works.
Same.
Sure. Well, actually, the DB that I was talking you about is like an etcd. There is like something called Cilium Cluster Mesh API server, something like that, and it's just an etcd and it's exposed to every cluster. Everything has their own credentials, and voila, basically. Anyway.
Okay. Cool. Do Mike? I think you're next. And I see you're +1 on the cluster status. I think or the service import status. I think that's worth continuing to look into. Like I don't think these conversations need to be coupled. Whether the import export time um, uh, conflicts are, where they show up, I don't think needs to be coupled to whether or not having status on an import is a good idea. It is something that's kind of come up in the past. Um, but this feeds nicely into Mike, your next topic.
So I'm going to throw a big wrench into things here. I'm hoping that I've had enough conversations with folks that this is not as controversial as it initially appears. But I've heard a lot of complaints about some of the fields on service import that are under spec currently. Um, there has been some feeling that they should be under status instead. Notably, the GKE APIs have actually forked this and already have them under status. On Azure, when we were building Fleet, we I heard people complaining about it, but they're still under spec, just to stick with the existing upstream CRDs. Obviously, this would require a like breaking change API version bump. And I wanted to one get like a broad. This is great. There's so many people in this meeting. I would like to get like broader appetite for a change like this. and also kind of understand what would next steps be. Is this something that would require a KEP, or is this something that should be done like as a PR within the MCS API repo?
So yeah, I guess starting from the back part, it would be a PR. I think because it definitely doesn't need a separate KEP for changing this. This has been controversial. It's been like probably a year and a half since we last talked about it, but this is not the first time. You know, as you say, GKE does things differently. I think in part because of the controversy. My personal opinion is that status has kind of always felt more accurate as to what it is, given that it is the status of a service. I think that if I remember correctly, and again, it's been a while, the counter to that, which also makes some sense, is that this is a resource owned um, uh, by the MCS implementation, and it's defining basically its own spec for that import. That one kind of makes sense to me, but I'm curious what other folks think, and I think regardless, it's going to be a discussion on the PR and probably not something for this meeting. Tim, I'm going to name you. I think you had thoughts back. Oh, there you go.
Yeah,
It's a
I had to pull up the spec to refamiliarize myself with it, but I assume you're talking about the IPs field and maybe it's it, right?
IPs, ports, and type, I believe.
So IPs I can sort of buy. Ports and type feel pretty analogous to the regular service definition, right? So maybe it would be helpful to understand the rationale for why status feels like a better fit.
I think because it would be mirroring from whatever the service that's being exported over there has defined. And if you're, as a user, filling in those things manually in spec, then you would get a mismatch or invalid match of some sort.
I mean, I'll take a pass too, because I think this is what I said. I think this is the same thing I said last time we discussed this years ago, and I don't have a super strong opinion, but it seems like the whole service import is just a status. Like it's a status of a remote service, and that's the main.
So look, what we call spec and status, you alluded to this before, Jeremy, is very context dependent of who is writing what in what time. Spec is the thing that you're asking for, whoever the person who or actor who is authorized to write the object, and status is what you got if there is a request response process here. Not everything has a request response, right? In this case, who writes service import? I mean, the design was that some control plane actor writes service import, not some end user, right? If we thought that it was some end user who was writing service import, like it's an alternate universe, the user explicitly defines, I want to import this service into my namespace. Then yeah, spec and status would have a lot more meaning there. The other thing to think about is you can't set status at creation time. So any field you want to set at creation time has to be spec.
Right. Or neither, which is maybe in hindsight might have made more sense, because if the whole resource is a status, this is all coming back to me now, thanks Tim. I think, yeah, the reason why we went with spec is because it's owned by the implementation, and because we didn't want to have dual updates so that we could create and then set the status.
And like, if we think that this alternate universe where users can explicitly import a service is a viable universe that we want to explore before we fully lock this thing down, then we should have that conversation, because it's an interesting universe that honestly we didn't explore very deeply. but it would mean that we would have to change the schema quite a bit. And I don't actually know how the GKE version drifted from this. I took my eye off the ball there, but sorry, I'm reading the chat at the same time. I think they are declarative in the sense of they trigger some other actors to act in response to it, but they're not a sort of request response. Now, I will also say some of the things that we did in service are completely broken, right? Like, honestly, cluster IP should have been a request response thing. You should have requested it through spec and gotten it through status, and everybody should be reading it through status, not through spec. We didn't quite have that philosophy pinned down at the time that service was written, so it is what it is for now. But if we were doing service all over again, I would have done it as a bimodal field. I see Ryan with a hand up.
Yeah, so if I understand correctly, that's also something that it's been a while. So just also you refresh my memory. I think the problem we have with the spec was, as you said, the spec is something you have when you create the field. At least in our mode, when we implement that, we don't have those IP addresses when we start. We use the controller to reconcile to get those IP addresses. That's why initially we don't have those in the spec. That's I think it's the main reason we feel like those needs to be in the status, so that we can have spec say, I want to import this service, and then we go into every cluster to see how many of them are there, what are their IPs, and then the controller will fill up these IP address. Then when we do that, we feel like when we fill that, we need to fill that into status instead of going back into the spec. I think that's the high level of it. I may miss some details.
So that's what happens today with the API server and service, except unlike every other resource in our universe, we do it synchronously instead of asynchronously. The controller is, inside the API server that does the IP allocation. So it feels more first class, but really it's a controller. If we were inventing service today, I think we would do as you described, which is put IPs in status. But there also needs to be a way for the user to request a specific one, at least in service there is, right? So it would exist both in spec and in status. And if you put something in spec, you would either get that something back in status as an affirmation, or you would get an error, right? An asynchronous error, so a condition or something. So like, if we want to try to right that wrong with MCS, that would be okay. Or if we think that it's more important to be consistent with service, which I think was the dominating thought when we first sketched this stuff out, Jeremy, if I recall.
Well, we wanted services to work consistently, but ideally nobody's really interacting with service import. That was kind of the hope, was that service import is kind of an implementation detail that you use to get the IP for the cluster set service, and the implementation uses to get you a .clusterset.local name.
Well, somebody consumes it, right? Like whoever's publishing it into DNS or whatever.
But that would be the MCS implementation.
I mean, that's yes.
So consistency is important, but I guess where we were really concerned with consistency is for consumers. So for producers, it's adding a service export is trivial, and you get something, and your service kind of works the way you'd expect. And then for consumers, it feels just like a regular service. But most consumers are not actually like querying service objects.
That's right.
And so that, I don't think consistency there might be nice as well, but that wasn't in a bucket of like must be consistent. We had like the must be consistent was the way service names resolve, and the way cluster IPs function, and the way headless IPs or headless services work from that consumer perspective.
So I can see that both ways. I don't object to fixing this. except for, we're this far down the road, is it worth the churn at this point? It should be a factor.
And I will say that not well, having an IP when you create the service import is a nice having it on spec is a nice way to avoid the double write to set it on a status. I don't think there's anything wrong, given that it's still the implementation doing all the management here, with an implementation that doesn't know the IP right away, writing twice. If that's there's nothing wrong with having two writes, but making it mandatory seems like a slight negative.
I think for built-in APIs, there's actually a way to allow writing status at creation, but for CRDs, I don't think there is.
Yeah, there is for internal. I mean, I think it's a reasonable thing because it's effectively default population. I think it would need a bigger discussion, but there have been use cases before where status updates on create and initializing them to a certain known state actually is advantageous. So an example would be if there's a bunch of optional objects in the status field that you want an emission controller to set. I can imagine some scenarios where you actually want to make sure that the right things are there in status. And this gets into the whole status is recreatable, which we really need to say, we need to have an official position on that. And that would probably be part of trying to figure out whether this is possible to change it in CRD.
We actually do, Clayton, you might have missed at some point, we dropped that requirement.
We dropped the requirement. I don't think we dealt with all the implications of, now that we don't have that requirement, do we have the right level of support in CRDs, and do we have a principle? Because we still have the spec and status sub-resources, and we had the security issue on updating metadata on status, which is actually a valid use case for some orchestrators that need to add custom status data on annotations. So I do think it deserves a retread.
Yes, well, and we had a whole other cap open for more granular access control. So let's not rat hole too much on that because it is a very deep rat hole. But I will ask, passing it back to Mike and Ryan and whoever, is it a consideration that you have a different actor who creates the service import than who would write the IPs field?
Different.
Like a different control plane or a different service account or something.
So I have that as a currently out of scope consideration for future potential of cross cluster set things. You may need to have a user manually import a thing because your controller can't automatically stick it in a known namespace. If you're outside the cluster set or in a different cluster set and sameness doesn't apply. Then you'll need to have it manually created. Some controller is setting the status on if it matches a thing that was exported to that cluster set. That is a consideration. I don't think it's not a primary consideration. It's more of just future design space.
Yeah, to directly answer the question, I think at least in our implementation, it's the same actor. I think the interesting part is exactly someone mentioned that if we can write the status directly, or it becomes instead of normal spec and reconcile, it becomes basically like the service, right? The no reconcile. We basically get the info and write the result directly instead of two-step. That's interesting. I never thought about that because we normally do a look at spec and do a reconcile and then write the result back into the status. One thing I'm just curious, I think this is going to become a long discussion. A middle ground, I think it could be we have the spec as an optional field and we have a status there. Then the implementation can either do a one-shot right into both or do the two steps. Right, you can write into both the spec, right? Write the spec and the status at the same time just to confirm, or you just write a empty spec and then reconcile that into the status. But that's some middle ground. Sounds like can satisfy both cases. But that's a long. I mean, I think we need to have more time discussing in the separate discussion or in the PR, things like that.
I'm not sure I understand. What would be the value of having both?
Both is to satisfy two cases. One case is, I think the original Jeremy's case is the actor just write that when the service import is written, whoever wrote that already knows the IPs. Just one shot, if I understand correctly.
It doesn't have to be already knows the IPs. It really needs to be one actor or one component is really responsible for the IP. It could be two-stage.
And two-stage, that's the part I don't get. Is the second stage is that so initially there's no IP in the spec and then write again into the spec?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that is literally what service does today. It's just done all synchronously, so you can't actually observe the intermediate state. But that is what the API server does.
Sure, but that doesn't. At least that's not our normal pattern. Our normal pattern is always go.
You're right.
Spec is the kind of the descriptive way, and the status is we treat that as the result. So we follow that pattern when we do this.
Service is a weird anomaly because of the fact that it existed in the very first commit, and we sort of stuck with that API.
Yeah, that part we understand. We're just not sure we should follow that pattern instead of the more common pattern later on. More, I was not in the first day, so the pattern I follow is always pretty much the spec status pattern. That's why we were.
I mean, the other question, not to just blow this up, is like, is this really a normal spec status type resource, or is service import really kind of internal machinery, more like endpoint slices that don't have a spec or status and are just state? Just to add more options to the debate.
Yeah, that's what it's always felt to me. It's like it's really an implementation detail. It's only that changed a bit with Gateway API starting to use it. But just in the context of the MCS KEP, it's the object that's used to transfer data from the exporting cluster to all the others.
Yeah.
So
in the interest of time, given that we have more on the agenda, I recommend turning this into a PR so we can discuss there.
I think the PR would take the form of, what if we added IPs to status? And I mean, at least IPs. IPs seems like an obvious one. Ports and type, I'm less sure about, but we can have the discussion too. And if we did, what would that mean for implementation?
Mm-hmm. Right. And to me, I think it seems like there's a few options that came up here, but I think, Tim, for me, it would either be IP for the reasons you said. It would be everything because we just decide that service import is in fact a status of sorts, since nothing is actually declared directly, although that might change in the future. Or another option, or keep it as is because it works and we convince ourselves that the implementation is the actor responsible for it, basically define the spec. And I'm sure there will be some back and forth and we'll never get to full consensus, so we'll end on a vote, but I think it'd be good to catalog some of the discussion and give folks who weren't able to make it more time to think about it.
Cool. Appreciate the discussion. Thanks, y'all. This context helps a lot.
Thank you. Corentin.
Yeah, I think I'm
next.
on the agenda. I wanted to expand on the discussion. I can share screen. Interesting. I wanted to talk about cluster inventory and credentials and different models of using it. And I don't know who's the host. Oh, you go. Thank you.
You should be able to share. Try again.
Yep, I can now. Sweet. Can you see it? All right.
Yes.
And please interrupt me anytime. I tried to put that to think about it and see if we can make progress on cluster inventory, on usage of it, and standardize some stuff. We'll see. I want to hear more what people think. So this is, I think, what we have today. Workload clusters, and we have a cluster inventory representing each one of them. Name TBD, I guess, but at least we'll have an object. What I'm trying to achieve here, the models of interactions, I talked about that. I say multi-cluster controls, aka features. I work on GKE, so we call them features, but multi-cluster controls is effectively what they are. Those would be the consumers of that cluster inventory. And especially I want to look like the models and what the permission look like for those models and how we set them. So if we look at Argo CD, they're not using cluster inventory, but they have a bunch of secrets, and each secret has its own credentials, and they have a bunch of RBAC on the cluster as well. And whenever they add a cluster, I think they have to add the server secrets for it. They have to add the RBAC for it at the bottom right. So there's like at least 2 steps, but it seems cluster inventory is covering kind of the gray part on the top left, where it's got a definition of all the clusters. So now we get into these things like, I think I was trying to generalize the Argo CD part and getting into defining a multi-cluster controller, aka feature, what I'm calling them. I'm like, oh, if I keep the credentials here, it's fine for a feature. I can write RBAC, but then as soon as I get a second one, I was like, ah, shit. It's like, I need potentially different credentials. Otherwise, I'm ending up having those multi-cluster controllers having cluster admin on every single controller, pretty much. So the credentials living in the workload cluster were not too great, it seemed. So I was like moving the credentials instead to each feature has its own credentials, and it knows what it needs. And therefore, they each have their own RBAC. And so far, it seems like for a push model, it could work pretty well. It's like that's what Argo does, but generalized, I guess, to multiple controllers. The tricky part I was running into, and I don't know if I have this, you have to automate in every cluster. So whenever the cluster comes up, it'll register or figure out a way to get a cluster inventory object, but you also need to get the RBAC for every single feature you have in every single cluster. So there needs to be something automating this RBAC. And obviously that can be the feature itself, otherwise it would have cluster admin on it. So it's like a little chicken and egg there, but it needs to get there. So that was my first problem for push model. For pull, the models, I flipped it. I tried to put some names on the things. I call them agents, and the thing still in the cluster is still called the controller. We could change that name just to have the discussion. But then here, this needs to be installed everywhere, but it's pretty much the same thing, and it has its own local credentials. And then we need still centralized RBAC. So the RBAC flip side. And so this is the part that needs to be automated. So whenever a new cluster comes up, well, we need a new little RBAC for the right agent or the right feature, depending on what we're doing there. So there's like still more automation needed there. Mostly for the RBAC, I was thinking. So yeah, that's what I had here. Well, this is this got way complicated, way fast. I'm sorry. This is actually what we do for GKE Fleet. We're a push model, effectively. Our controllers are run by us, but we have a feature authorizer that sets RBAC for every single of the known features. So that's kind of like an example of how it can be done. Obviously, the feature authorizer part needs to be cluster admin and trusted, but you only have one of them, and then you need a trusted list of features because this guy could be a confused deputy, kind of creating the credentials there. Obviously, otherwise you use a CD, and if the CD knows about what features are meant to be, it can install the permission, like the RBAC, on every cluster when the cluster, either when the cluster comes up or it can be a separate process that targets every single cluster. But at the end of the day, it's not really linked to the cluster inventory there. So I don't know exactly if that's the best thing. I had a bunch of other slides. For simplicity, I kept them out, but they're in the deck. But there's a few things I wanted to see is like there's a bunch of patterns, and I was curious if we wanted to standardize some or encourage some more than others. Obviously, I wanted to hopefully I convince you maybe or not that the credentials really belong on the per feature / multi-cluster controller thing. I don't think they should share them, but then that means they cannot be in cluster inventory. Cluster inventory sounds like it could have the endpoint, but not the credentials part. And setting the RBAC seems to be almost a more complicated process than the credentials themselves. There needs to be some automation, and I don't know if that's one of the things we need to standardize or leave people doing the CD. And there's a bunch of ways to do it and all that. So yeah, honestly, that's all I had. Trying to keep it simple here, but love to get feedback here. And I can't see anyone because I'm here.
Ryan, you're first, I think.
Just comment. I think whatever you said definitely makes sense. To me, it would be great if we can standardize that, especially in the terms of trying to get a working model. So the whole point of cluster inventory in the beginning was we want to allow third party, especially like the case you said, the Argo CD case, to integrate with different multi-class solutions. So it'd be great if we could standardize using some use cases like Argo CD multi-queue as an example and a standardizer. At least for me, that seems to be very valuable. The question I had was, how do we proceed? Because as far as I know, you're drawing kind of GKE specifics, something specific. How can we generalize that to work with, different third-party projects? That'd be great. I would definitely interested to work with whoever is interested in this to move this along this line.
Yeah, and to be clear, so like the GKE, like the feature authorizer thing I showed is specific to GKE, and it's because also maybe this trust because we have another cloud there. I don't know if that's the model we would want to have in the cluster as well. I mean, that could be slightly different, but that's one of the models that exists, maybe to push permissions. Yeah. I don't know what's next after that. Sorry.
I think it's me. I think kind of what we've proposed so far is pretty compatible with this because we don't require that there's credentials in the cluster inventory. We just require that we just ask that there's instructions on how to connect to the cluster, which in some implementations may be credentials, but for like GKE might just be a cluster name, and then we rely on other means. So it seems very compatible. Like there's nothing stopping you from having credentials as an external mechanism that's like per controller or like a workload identity type thing using GKE capabilities. If that's how the implementation works. But I think it's a good question. Regardless of compatibility with this, should this be standardized as well? To me, it would be a separate initiative. I don't think we want to add features to cluster inventory, like as the KEP, but I think it might make sense to start another effort to define how you like basically patterns for using cluster inventory alongside. Curious what folks think about that.
Mike?
No, I agree with Jeremy. I actually have a different topic. But yeah, I completely agree with Jeremy. We definitely can't have the quets in the cluster inventory or cluster profile. That's what the community decide on the name on. And I have the KEP. So shout out to the KEP and the PR as well. Jeremy, please take a look. I have the PR. But yeah, definitely cluster profile should be something that's there. And then the whatever controller will see the profile and then ask for the quests themselves, and the question being the cluster profile. But my other topic is, in your presentation, do you list your in your diagram, in your chart graph, it's a cluster scope, right? In your management cluster, I feel like your cluster profile is cluster scope. Yeah,
Right.
that's a discussion that we wanted to get into. But I'll let you wrap up, please.
Oh, are you saying the having a central cluster, like a management cluster, is not necessarily a thing that was planned for cluster inventory, or that
No, it was optional, but everyone has been asking for a CRD reference implementation of the CRD, so we need to provide one. And then I feel like the more use cases that we try to come up with namespaces, and then it doesn't really make much sense because it's just too hard to define a particular single purpose for namespace scope. And then I asked around, and everyone seems to prefer cluster scope. And then in your diagram, it is cluster scope as well, right?
Oh, you mean the resource cluster profile?
The resource itself in your cluster inventory.
I don't think it changes the diagram. Honestly, I don't want I don't think the diagram emits an opinion on that, to be honest. It just assumes that there are some cluster profiles somewhere, and that we want to have controllers leverage them. You could imagine if they're namespaced, the multi-cluster controllers could know which namespace they're in or how to find them and leverage them. I don't think it necessarily influences. I think it's a great topic to discuss, for sure. It's not the one I'm trying to wait on, though.
Got it. Okay, sorry about that.
No worries. No.
Please wrap up. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. So it sounds like we want some reference architectures, and we'll see where to move from there. I'm happy to keep documenting on that, and I can see what I can propose, what I can find that's shared enough in the models I have. If you can think about other models, please let me know. I'd love to push more and see if there's like at least the lowest denominator for now. And if something emerges as more of a direction we want to take, I think we can try to push for that direction. But for now, it seems to be agnostic.
Yeah, Corentin, maybe sharing a brief write-up corresponding with your slides that folks can comment on and think about other use cases might be helpful for getting the conversation going.
Docs based? Better?
I think, yeah, probably.
Cool. Thank you. How do I stop?
Bobby?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that, a lot of these conversations will be more useful after we have something concrete in place, right? So I know without a CRD, without any reference architecture, without any mental model of how we want to manage multiple clusters and so on, a lot of these things become abstract and are hard to discuss. So what are the next steps for maybe starting to make things a little bit more concrete? Should we start with a CRD? Is there any plan?
Yeah, I can take that one, or Ryan can take that as well. So we finally decided on the name cluster profile. That's what we're gonna go with. And then now that we have that finalized, another thing we want to finalize is the scope of the API for Kubernetes. Is a cluster scope or namespace scope? I think we're more. Ryan, please correct me if I'm wrong. I think we're more gearing towards cluster scope because it just feels more natural, and it allows, in my opinion, it allows for more subdivision for multiple purposes versus a namespace scope. You sort of have to sort of define whatever that namespace. And we don't have the nested namespace like we mentioned, like we discussed in the last meeting. So I think in cluster API, the cluster, Jack, please correct me more. The cluster is namespace scope, but that is a little bit different from our the cluster profile use case, because that's more like, hey, in this namespace, you're allowed to create these clusters, but versus, oh, this cluster profile or cluster inventory, hey, this cluster already exists. Now doesn't make sense to link it to a namespace. And I feel like to start with, I feel like having it as cluster scope makes a lot of sense. And I think that's the only thing that's sort of blocking us from having that CRD reference implementation pushed to our cluster inventory repo. So it'll be really great if we can sort of resolve that as well. Ryan, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with as well, Bob, if I butchered your name, that we would like to move forward with CRD. I think we can discuss more on the CRD PRs. I think their credentials, they're on the name. I assume name is done. We don't have to go back to naming. And then the credentials, the names, the scope of the CRDs, that we can have a PR so that we can have concrete things that comment on. And I feel like it may also speed up the decision a little bit faster. Instead of have a discussion every 2 weeks, we have a PR and asynchronously comment on. Hopefully that can speed up these things a bit.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
It makes sense to me as well, yes.
To follow up on what Mike was talking about, the namespace and cluster CRD, is the discussion in one of the PR? Sorry, I missed it. I am curious to see pros and cons on each and how you make the decision.
There is a doc somewhere.
Yeah, we do have a doc on it. So the CAP itself is not meant to be a Kubernetes exclusive API. So we didn't really define it to be a namespace or a cluster scope.
Yeah,
so it's for us, it's more implementation details. So when Ryan say a PR, I think he meant creating the actual reference CRD in our cluster inventory API repo, and then in there, I guess we can drive a bit more discussion on the namespace and cluster scope of the API. Sorry, Ryan, go ahead.
No, just I'm saying I just pasted the doc in the chat.
Thank you.
Ryan, do you have anything else? That's all really what I want to bring up.
Yeah, same. Just wanna. I think it will be hard to use this every 2 weeks to have this have a finalize all the details. So I think we will just go ahead with the CRD PR and welcome all the comments, and hopefully we can drive that to some conclusion.
That's that's a great idea. I think PR is definitely a better way to go, much faster. Jack, before I hand it to you, because we're going to flip, I'll talk for Clayton's. The new work group for serving has a first meeting next week. I think multi-cluster serving is probably going to be interesting to at least a few folks in this room. So I'm going to try to join. I hope to see some others there. It's exciting. Mike, your question on how it's different than device management, I think the scope, serving is more like apps. I mean, it's under SIG apps, right? Basically focused on app constructs needed for making Kubernetes great for serving inference. And device management, I think, is certainly connected to that, but very targeted for device management, whereas like who knows what new constructs we're going to need to make serving play nice with Kubernetes.
Okay,
does that make sense?
I'll have to read the blurb to get a little more background, but I think maybe.
Okay, yeah. Clayton linked the doc. I recommend reading the doc. It'll say it much better than me, and then you can ignore everything I said and use that as a source of the truth. So the last 4 minutes here, Jack, take it away.
Yeah, this should be really quick, actually. So someone very kindly added a hyperlink in the agenda to the issue that I created last week or the week prior. Thank you so much. So just a kind of a meta comment that I would advocate that we organize and try to accelerate efforts towards defining the scope of. The topic is MCS API graduation from Alpha. So we've already discussed some super concrete things that would obviously be prerequisites to that graduation. So the main thing is the first step is just to define the scope of what graduation looks like, and it's been that issue is basically a lift and shift from the original CAP of MCS. So yeah, I don't think there's too much to discuss in like gory detail right now, but look out for folks poking other folks to nail that down, and then we can go and do it in the next, I don't know, 6 months, 3 months.
Hopefully, yeah. Let's aim for 3 months. Like it's.
I like that.
I'd say it's long enough.
6 weeks,
And,
6 days, and keep going down.
Well, I think the biggest friction at this point is going to be the question raised today about moving spec to status. Obviously, if we're going to make that change, that's going to introduce some overhead, but we probably need to figure that out sooner rather than later. That should happen before we go to beta, because alphas can be broken, betas are a lot trickier. But yeah, I'd love to see this finally move forward, and then hopefully the beta to GA at this point. I think we're pretty strict on our beta criteria, so beta to GA will hopefully just be time. And at this point, I think we have enough implementations out there that it shouldn't be too controversial, assuming we can get folks on board with any late changes that we decide to make.
Cool. Yeah, the beta to GA thing, that sounds like the idiom, so that's fair. So we'll focus on the alpha to beta. It'll be the bulk of the work.
Awesome. Okay. Well, I will see you all on GitHub then, it sounds like.
Jeremy, one last thing. Could you check your Kubernetes Slack, please? If anyway.
Yes.
Can you do
Yes.
that out, please? It's nothing too important. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah, we'll do. Thank you. All right.
Carry on.
Happy Tuesday.
Thanks, Jeremy.